This lesson will be the final mini lesson in the Jacqueline Woodson Author Study Unit. I have taken an excerpt from Woodson's novel Harbor Me, which is about a group of students that are pulled to a room, and every Friday, this group of students are meant to spend time in this room for the last hour of school and simply talk to one another. Um, their teacher, Miss Laverne, is a teacher who seems like she is trusted. And one of the most important statements that I took out of this excerpt that I'd like the kids to focus on is what's unfamiliar shouldn't be scary and shouldn't be avoided either. That's a quote that I would like the students to really reflect upon. I also want the students to think about why these group of kids are being pulled to this room to talk, because as the kids continue to read the excerpt, they find out that the main character has a parent who is in prison, and there's also another student in the room that also has a parent in prison. So, some of the objectives that I would like my students to achieve during this lesson are for them to be able to describe differences between the characters in the story by tracking traits, motivations, feelings, interactions, and this would be listed out through a journal entry on a character web. I would also like the students to be able to empathize with not only the characters, but with other people in general, because once we're able to develop a sense of empathy within the students for characters, it will help them to apply that to real life. And that's something that I like to talk about with the students at the end of the readings. So, my rationale is to hopefully bring awareness with this lesson to the students about equity in the classroom, and that some of their peers may be going through tough times that maybe they don't want to talk about, but I really like to cultivate an atmosphere in my classroom that is one that is safe, and that students can be vulnerable and open up and share with one another, because I think it is so important for us to not only talk to one another about what's going on in our lives or what's going on inside of us, but to also for us to listen and then thoughtfully respond to each other. So, one of the normal things that I do during my reading or writing workshop is I have the students meet me at the Hangout Corner. I find that this really helps to chunk lessons, and it helps the kids get up and have a little bit of cognitive dissonance. I really like them to have a seat and just maybe spend 30 seconds to a minute chatting with each other and getting comfortable, and then I'll draw their attention to an anchor chart, which is up on my wall there. I usually start out my mini lessons with a connection mostly to my personal life, and then I try to connect what we're doing to the student's personal life as well. So I might say something like this. When I was a girl, sometimes in school, I would have trouble focusing on my work. And when this happened, it was usually because of something that was going on with my friends. Maybe someone said something unkind to me, or maybe it was because my parents got into an argument the night before and my thoughts were on that. We all have things that happen in our lives outside of school, some good, some bad. And I really want you to think about today, has this ever happened to you? Have you ever felt that you've had something so big or distracting going on outside of school that you've had a tough time in school focusing? Maybe it was just for a day, or maybe you had a really rough year. Maybe you've had a few rough years. If you can think of a time when this happened to you and you're brave enough to share, I'd like you to turn and talk to somebody near you. Then I would allow the students to go ahead and turn and talk to one another. And you usually have at least a few kids that are brave enough to talk to each other. Usually the kids will sit near their friends. If I see that maybe there's only one or two kids sharing, I might ask them to share with everyone. I would ask, are you comfortable enough to share with everyone? And then if there are really no kids sharing, I might think of a particular example that I would share with the kids just to get the talk and the thoughts generating, and then maybe reach out and ask again if the students would be comfortable sharing and opening up. Because again, I really like to build an atmosphere of trust in my classroom. And through talking about our life and everything that we go through, it really helps us listen to each other and learn from one another. So, after doing the personal connection, having the students share out with one another, I would then turn to my anchor chart that would be hanging up on the wall. And I'd tell the students that today they're going to be reading an excerpt from Jacqueline Woodson's novel Harbor Me. I'd remind them about the work that we have done with her other books, and maybe we'd talk about some of the themes that we had seen going on in her texts, about characters having to overcome boundaries, and that life is not always easy. So I would invite the students to think about a few particular things while they are reading today. I'd say something like, do you think life gets tougher as you get older? And kids might start nodding their heads. Some kids might raise their hand. And I, again, remind the students that's just something I simply want you to think about. I also will say to them, I also, while you're reading today, would really like you to notice these characters in the story. Who are they? And really, the big thing is, why are they being pulled into this room? And at that point, I've really given the students no background on the text, and curiosity is starting to peak in some of them. And I'll say, yeah, there is a group of students that are being pulled to a room, and this is going to kind of make the students want to go off and solve this mystery when they go to read. Um, Now, I gave the students some things to think about, but I would also like to give the students some things to do while they're reading. I want them to track characters in the story. I would like you to jot names on post-its if you like, mark up the text if you want to highlight, circle, underline in the text names and jot notes in the margins. That will be helpful because you are going to be creating a character web in your reading journals, and the information that you seek out in the text will make it so much easier for you to create your journal entry when you are finished reading. So I would then tell the students you're going to be reading this excerpt in your book club groups at your tables. And also, I'm going to be pulling a small group today to complete some work with. So as the students start to transition back, materials will be out on the tables, stories will be out there for them. I would remind the students to please take out their annotation tools, highlighters, pencils, post-its, whatever they'd like to use. And I might also remind the students again with a slide up on the projector of the things that I would like them to think about while they're reading, and again, the things that I would like them to do. I teach seventh graders normally. These lessons are meant for third to fifth graders, and I've taught from third to seventh grade. Anytime you can reiterate and repeat directions to students is helpful, because I guarantee you not all of them are listening when you go through it the first time. Not all of them are listening when you go through it the second or the third time. And sometimes I like to just kind of stand as they're all getting situated and observe the room and look to see who's kind of got a blank stare on their face. And then I will go and approach that student to ask them, let explain to me what you're going to be doing today. Also, keeping in mind if you have special ed students, students with IEPs, or students with 504s that might need directions clarified for them or repeat it to them. Those are students that I'd like to get to also before I go to my small group at the table. Now, the small group that I will be pulling, this is a group that will be struggling readers because this text is a little bit tougher. Sometimes I don't always pull struggling readers. I might pull a heterogeneous group of mixed level students. I might pull a high level group to challenge them with something. But today I would like to pull a group with struggling readers. And as the students are reading the text. And as I probably start reading the text to them, I will stop at particular points and ask the students questions. So at the beginning of the text, after I get through the first page and I start moving on to the second, we have these two students, Esteban and Amari. So Esteban asks, "Are we getting transferred to a new class?" He put his knapsack down between his ankles and hugged himself. Amari had taken his hand off Esteban's shoulder, but was standing close to him. When Esteban shivered, Amari put his arm back. I heard him whisper, "It's all good, bro. It's all good. Miss Laverne's not gonna be taking us somewhere we don't want to be." So at the end of this paragraph here, I would stop and I would look up to the students and I would say, wow, like we just saw kind of a powerful interaction between Esteban and Amari. I'm going to ask you guys a question. How do we think Esteban feels in this moment? Going to this room, being pulled in this small group of students, being pulled to this room. How do you think he feels in this moment? And also, what kind of kid do we think Esteban is? And I might have the students talk about it or maybe jot down on a post it. And then once I see that the kids are done talking to each other or jotting, I might also say, hey, if you're finished jotting early on that post it, what about Amari? What are you thinking of Amari in the interaction between Esteban and Amari? I also want you to think about, how do the students view their teacher, Miss Laverne? Because there's a really good statement there that we see that gives us a little bit of a picture into what the students think about Miss Laverne. Now, while the students are doing these jots and discussing with one another, we'll share out and then we'll move back to the text and continue reading. At a particular point, I might leave the students with a card with questions on it, and I might even have the students stop at particular points in the story. I might have that marked off on text that I'm giving to my small group students at the back table. I don't like to spend the entire time with the students at the back table because it's important for classroom management to circulate while students are working in book clubs and make sure that they're on task. And these are kind of the ways that I make sure that students are on task. I like to give them laminated thought cards while they're reading of things to think about. So some of the points that I might have on these thought cards, I don't like to bombard them with too much, but I have a few things written down here. So, how do you think the students feel about their teacher, Miss Laverne? Which is a question that I'm asking to my small group, but I also want all of my students to think about. I would also like them to choose 3 characters besides Miss Laverne to focus on. Again, they should be thinking about the characters as they're reading. And one of those characters, I'm going to require them that one needs to be the main character. I think it's very important to give the students choice in choosing things that they would like to focus on and that they find interesting, choice in how they organize their thoughts. But it is important for us to say, you have choice, but I also need you to do this thing because life is really about that. Finally, the students are pulled to this room to talk for an hour every Friday. Why do you think that is? And that's kind of like this overarching question that I want the students to think about throughout the story. So, after about, I would say 3/4 of the way, as I'm, going with my small group, then starting to circulate when I get the small group probably halfway through the story, I'm circulating. I see that most of my book clubs are finishing up with their story. I'm going to do a mid-workshop stop, and I'm going to go through what the students need to do for their journal page model. So all the students will stop. They will put down what they're working on. Everything will be out of their hands, and they will be tracking me as I explain these directions to them. I would have this model journal page posted up on the screen, and I have a few characters here listed out. This is what I would like the students to do. They're doing a character web. So I have a main character from the story here, which is what I'm requiring from the story that the students are reading. And I have two supporting characters. And I'm also listing out character traits, maybe motivations, feelings, personality traits, physical traits. It could be a mix of things, whatever the students are finding important about the characters that they're choosing. I'm going to remind them that their character web should look similar to this example. They don't have to organize it exactly in the same way, but they can if they wish. And then down at the bottom of their character web, at the bottom of their journal page, I want the students to answer the two following questions. Why do you think the students are in this room to talk? Because this is a question that I've been having the students think about during the whole text. And also, what does Miss Laverne mean when she says, but what's unfamiliar shouldn't be scary, and it shouldn't be avoided either? So I'd like the students to answer these two questions underneath their character web in 2 to 3 complete sentences, which I think is good for 3rd to 5th graders. If it was 7th grade, I might have them answer with a little bit more detail, reminding them to also use text examples to support their thinking. So, as the students start moving off to their independent work and completing their journal entries, time is winding down. If I see that students are starting to finish up, they might move on to reading something else. If students are starting to finish but we're running out of time, I want to make sure that I'm closing the lesson out, and I would ask them to finish up whatever they have not finished in class for homework. So I'll pull the students back together, ask them to close everything up, and give their attention to me. I'm going to remind them to remember back to the beginning of the lesson at the Hangout Corner when I share how I had troubles in school, sometimes because of external issues. One of the questions I asked you to think about and write down during your reading is, why were the students pulled to this room? So I'm going to say to the students, I'd like a few of us to share our thoughts out in a grand conversation style. Grand conversation is when I let the students run the conversation and they know the rules for the grand conversation. They must run the conversation themselves. I don't really get involved unless I want to move the conversation along to another point. And the students must be speaking to each other, listening to each other, responding to each other, and making eye contact with one another. So the students are tracking the speaker no matter who it is. I would have the students start the grand conversation with the question, why were the students pulled in this room? Students will continue to add on to each other's thoughts. And during the grand conversation, I might stop them at particular points and say, okay, you did a good job with that, but how would you feel if you had a parent in prison or maybe a parent in a tough situation? And I would have the students then go off and talk about this themselves while again talking and listening and responding to one another. And then the final question that I'd like to add in is, which I think is really important for any lesson that a teacher is teaching. Why do you think we did this today? Why do you think we're reading stories like this one and we're having discussions like these? And that's always something that you want the students to figure out for themselves. So, how do I know that my lesson has been effective? A few different things. Number one, I want the students to be able to note some differences between the characters through their character web journal entry. I also want the students to have an idea of why the students are in the room and thinking about that we all have different lives and that outside of school, some of us might have tougher lives than others. And we need to be able to share those things at times and be vulnerable and listen and be understanding. I also want students to understand that we all learn differently, and that's okay. For this particular group of students, they needed to be pulled out for an hour and to talk to each other and get things out, and that would help them in school. Some kids might not need to do that. I also want the students to understand why we read stories like Harbor Me and take away a better understanding of one another, because we might not know what's going on in someone else's life unless we start having these conversations. And maybe it's a thought. If a student isn't willing to have a conversation, maybe it's a thought that the other student has. Like maybe they're having a tough day. Maybe something else is going on with them. Finally, um, I want students to also begin to develop a sense of welcoming towards those who are different, because when we're welcoming of others, we build trust. Trust allows for people to be more willing to open up. And when this happens, that's when we learn from one another. Um, we need to start having more conversations, listening to one another, and starting to understand one another than just grounding ourselves in what we think and feel, because we're getting nowhere doing those types of things. So here are my resources, and I hope you have enjoyed the lesson. What the